Hello and welcome to SEGA News Bits, and welcome to the Fantasy Zone. I'm Barry, with me is George.
Hello, everyone.
And the Fantasy Zone franchise is 30 years old in 2016, which makes us very old because, yeah, we're old. But it released in 1986 to arcades, and since then there's been several games, and we're going to talk about them. Not every single one, but we're definitely going to talk about the first game in the franchise and just some of the notable ones that came along since. First off, I'm going to ask George, what was your history with this franchise? Can you remember the first time you've played a Fantasy Zone game?
I actually could. When I was a kid, I'd never even heard of this franchise. This franchise was not popular in the West at all. I don't think so. I never remember hearing about it growing up. Even in magazines, I think it was probably pretty rare to talk about this game. I remember hearing about this game because I got really into shoot 'em ups and stuff when the Sega Saturn came out, because that was literally what the Sega Saturn had, at the time. So I kind of got into this genre, and it was kind of a new genre to me, so I was really obsessed with it. So I started looking at past games that were kind of alike, and then I found this, that Sega made this game called Fantasy Zone, so I obviously had to play it. Yeah, I went through a lot of trouble and actually got a copy of Fantasy Zone for I think the Master System, I'm trying to think. Or am I thinking two for the Master System? I'm not even sure. Not now. Yeah, it was pretty interesting. Very pastel coloring. There was nothing like this, at least for me at the time. I know there was a Namco game, I think. There was I can't remember what the name is called. The game is called.
Are you thinking of Twinbee?
Yes, Twinbee.
Twinbee, and that was actually from Konami, and that was released in 1985. But I don't know who's to say who copied who, right? I mean, even though it came out the year before.
No, I'm assuming that they copied the style, I guess, from them. But the gameplay is, I think, Fantasy Zone is its own game. This was like a Zivius. I think that's what the game was called. It kind of played like that game, Zivius, another Konami shooter, vertical scrolling shooter. Mm-hmm. Fantasy Zone was very unique, I think, in its own way. Like it had like a little economy system thing going on. It had money, obviously, because Japanese people are obsessed with money. I don't know what the hell it is. It had the boss fights. You could buy weapons. It had the shop. I thought it was amazing. I mean, and every single enemy had its own little pattern. But yeah. That game blew my mind. I was a fan right away. What about you, Barry?
Well, it like you said, it wasn't a very popular game in America, so I can't remember the first time I played it. It may have been in the maybe the late 90s. I probably finally got a hold of one to play. But I didn't really own a Fantasy Zone until I got my Master System a few years ago. And that's when I actually purchased my first physical copy without having to rely on, ulterior motives. But yeah, it's a really interesting game. It's that shoot 'em up genre that I guess shoot 'em up fans refer to, where it's cute little spaceships and it's not really violent. You're shooting little bells and butterflies and weird things like that. But I felt what made Fantasy Zone very unique and is that you could move left to right, and it wasn't really a scrolling stage. You could move at your own leisure. You'd think that would make it easier, but it didn't. It was hard as hell, which was so against the style. You'd look at this game, you go, oh yeah, give that to a kid. So I have to imagine that a lot of kids bought this game in the 80s and they were expecting something easy, and what they got was probably one of the most difficult games ever. But since then, I've played the 3D Classics releases, which we'll touch on a little later in our discussion here, and I fell in love with the franchise all over again.
It's funny, that boss fight in part 1, the one where the little blue, the little blue thing comes and gets you. That freaking fight is so cheap, dude. If I was playing in the arcades, I would lose a lot of money.
Oh, for sure. And that was the point.
That was the point, yeah. Taking your money in your pockets.
Yeah.
But this game was actually pretty successful in Japan as an arcade game compared to here, which I'm not even surprised considering, Japan will probably... This seems like a very Japanese franchise compared to other games that got popular in the West. Like, here we got Streets of Rage, Shining Force, stuff like that people like. Yeah, I don't think this cute 'em up stuff would have gotten popular. It was always... it has this cult fan base, but popularity would never have worked here.
Yeah, and it's it's interesting looking at the franchise and the many games that came out for it. Despite it being a very Japanese franchise, a lot of them came to the United States, even some really weird ones like Fantasy Zone The Maze. Like, who would have thought that would actually come over here?
It was different time, definitely, because like it was at the time when Sega like wanted as any game to come out, like because they had to compete with Nintendo.
It's interesting too to point out that Fantasy Zone 2, The Tears of Opa Opa, was the official sequel, but it released only to the Sega Master System, and so it wasn't until many years later that the Sega Ages release came out. I believe that was 2003, and M2, they're the ones that created a arcade version of the sequel.
It was actually 2008, which is even weirder considering that it's like way like closer to now.
Right. Oh, I'm sorry. There's the Sega Ages 2500 Volume 3 and then Volume 33. So, and those were released about 5 years apart. So yeah, 2008.
By M2, the guys that did the 3D classics, and they did a fantastic job with this System 16 version, which is very funny because they actually put it on the actual board. So this is the last game created on the Sega System 16 board.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool of them. Like they actually went on the hardware and made it, an official sequel.
Yeah, it's also, I'm sure another little fun fact that a lot of Sega fans know is that Fantasy Zone exists in the same universe as Space Harrier. And we won't get too far into it, but, it's some fans have known, but it was laid out by the Tumblr user Persona-sama, and he's a Twitter user too, we all use everything, that there's even a little timeline. So Fantasy Zone was in the year 6216, and then Space Harrier 3D was in 6221. So they were world building in the early 80s, and there's so much story behind these games. And you wouldn't know it by playing them, because you just kind of, all right, skip past this prologue stuff, I want to play the game. But it's pretty wild how in-depth they got with these.
Yeah, it's like their first, it's like the Marvel Universe before the Marvel Universe or anything like that, right?
Yeah, and it's funny too that, Fantasy Zone, the original game was to arcades, and the sequel, and Fantasy Zone also came to the Master System, but then the sequel was a Master System exclusive. And then you look at Space Harrier, the original Space Harrier was an arcade-only game that received ports, but Space Harrier 2 was a Mega Drive exclusive sequel. So it's like they launched their new hardware and they gave a very well-known arcade game at the time an exclusive sequel. So if you wanted to play Fantasy Zone 2, you needed a Master System. If you wanted to play Space Harrier 2, you needed a Mega Drive. And so that's also an interesting tie between the two franchises. What are some other games that you can think of that feature Opa Opa that people might not think of?
Games.
What am I thinking of? Can you think of the one? He has a drink named after him. I'm thinking about Arnold Palmer Tournament Golf.
Oh, your favorite game?
My favorite game. The music in that game, and I believe it's even from the same development team. It's the same artist who did the same music for Fantasy Zone did the music for that. Opa Opa appears on the menu screen, and also if you hit the ball 100 times without making it to the green, and then you put in, I believe, the Konami code, you get a Fantasy Zone minigame that it's really stripped down, but it uses the sound effects from Arnold Palmer, so it's like these weird golf sound effects playing Fantasy Zone.
Hole in one.
Hole in one. Well, no, not like that. Like, as evidence, it's such a weird franchise that has such a sprawling history, just even in the short amount of games that are out there. And
I would say that, like, even though the game hasn't had a new franchise entry in like 1,000 years, there is the Nintendo 3DS sequel that they ported the sequel to the 3DS, which has a Link Loop Land. Is that the right name?
That's right. And I mean, yeah, I'd argue that's a new entry in the franchise in 2014, which wasn't too long ago.
Yeah, so I would consider that a new game, because honestly, it's, even though it uses assets from the second game, it kind of reuses them in a way that if they released that game back in the olden days on arcade, people would just consider it its own game.
Yeah, for sure. So
would you ever want them to do a Fantasy Zone 3?
I think that would be really cool if M2 was awarded the chance to break out of the 3D Classics thing and start to do actual sequels. And I'm not asking them to do like Streets of Rage, 4 or something like that. But if they've proven themselves with Fantasy Zone 2 on the Sega Ages and on the 3DS, so why not give them a shot at doing a third game? I think that would be cool. Give Upa Upa and Opa Opa, double billing or something like that.
I think it would work. I think it'd be cool if they did it like, I guess, I want to say 2D because I'm a 2D like slut, but like I wouldn't mind. I wouldn't mind them doing it as a 3D game, like PSN or a Xbox Live Arcade game.
Yeah.
Like, don't make it super, but like release it first in the arcade, grab all those yins, and then port it to a console.
And I think we should also talk briefly about, do you want to cover any more about the franchise? I wanted to talk about how, it's pretty obvious that Opa Opa is the mascot of our site. We're an unofficial fan site, but we latched onto him pretty early on. Do you remember the first instance of him? Was he the little icon when you had a little browser tab? Was that when it originally started?
Yeah, that's actually where it originally started. I was looking for a tab character. I didn't want to go with Sonic because every site has Sonic. So I was like, man, this site, one of the things I wanted to do with SEGA Bits is like make it about Sega, not about Sonic. So I looked around and I was like, this little spaceship right here, this really speaks to me. So I knew that it was, Sega's first technically mascot, I guess they call him. So I was like, fuck it, I'm gonna use him. I like the way he looks, I like the colors. And it's been history from there on. You added him to the logo, right?
Yeah, I was asked by Shady, our web designer, if we wanted to touch up the logo, and I added this sort of Nike swoosh, sort of Opa Opa coming out from behind SEGA Bits. And it wasn't until I think last year that I revised it again. I actually went in there and gave him a little more depth. You can't really see it on how small it is, but I added a little sheen and some window effects, and I even gave him different wings. So they're not like weird little fingers. They're now like fluffy cloud wings. And I don't know, I've always really liked just the character as a mascot, just because he's so versatile, but he doesn't have, like, I'm referring to it as a he, but it's just a little spaceship. But he's so cute, he's got little yellow feet when he's on the ground, and the wings, and it's, I don't know, it kind of speaks to me as sort of, like soaring high and always moving. I don't know. You know what I mean? He's a great little mascot. And he doesn't, as much as I love Sonic, he doesn't have that, like attitude or edge to him. He's just Opa Opa. He's like the Superman of Sega characters, where it's just like he looks heroic, and he looks, I don't know, he's got, I don't know if that sounds weird, but that's how I read.
Can you ever see him, like, I don't know, like, because right now Sega's doing a lot of things where they want to use their IPs for franchises, I guess. Can you ever see him being used as like an anime or a TV show, or even, I don't know, a comic or something? I don't even know.
They tried that with Zillion. I feel like he's best suited just for games. There's not too much. You can't write a comic book about Opa Opa. Though it is interesting you mentioned that, because in the Archie Sonic comics, they had Opa Opa, or at least a giant ship that looks like him, as the escape pods for Sonic and the Freedom Fighters, like giant hover ship. And so when the ship was going down, they were all boarding Opa Opa, which is kind of weird.
Yeah, it's pretty weird. The only way I can see him is if he's a silent character like R2-D2 or something.
That's what I was trying to get at. R2-D2.
Yeah.
You remember of R2-D2?
Yeah. So, like, everybody loves R2-D2. So if you, like, I guess gave him, like, a main character that's not Fantasy Zone, maybe, like, I don't know, the guy from Space Harrier, and he just follows him around and does beeping sounds in a comedic fashion, it could work out.
Yeah.
But, like, the way R2-D2 works out with, what's his face, 3CPO, their little plots in every film.
Yeah.
So that's the only way I can see it working out. But, yeah. The franchise turns 30. Tell us what's your favorite entry into the franchise in the comments below. Give this video a like, or I don't know. Just do it.
Do whatever you want.
Just do whatever you want.
If you'd like more Sega news, check us out at segabits.com. And also, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and follow us on all our social networks.